The First Breath of a New World, 1607, 1783. The story of America does not begin with the roar of engines or the glow of city lights, but with the ancient, rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic Ocean and the whisper of wind through primeval forests. Long before it was a nation, it was a vast, breathing continent, a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions held by the indigenous peoples who had lived in harmony with this land for thousands of years. But our narrative today begins with a horizon change. Imagine the year 1607. Three weathered wooden ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, emerge from the gray Atlantic mist, navigating the tidal waters of what we now call Virginia. These were men of the Virginia Company, stepping onto the marshy banks of Jamestown. They weren't looking to create a global superpower. They were looking for gold, for passage to the Orient, and for a way to survive. The reality they found was harsh. The starving time nearly wiped them from history, leaving only a handful of survivors to witness the arrival of tobacco, the brown gold that would eventually anchor the Southern economy. But as the South found its footing in commerce, the North found its soul in conviction. In 1620, the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth, carrying the Pilgrims, men and women who sought not wealth, but the quiet sanctity of religious freedom. On that cold Massachusetts shore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple yet revolutionary agreement to govern themselves. It was a flickering candle of democracy in a world ruled by kings. The first Thanksgiving was a brief, sunlit moment of cooperation between the settlers and the Wampanoag people, but it was also a precursor to a century of complex, often tragic expansion. As the decades rolled by, 13 distinct colonies began to dot the coastline like stars in a twilight sky. From the rocky, industrious ports of New England to the sprawling, sun-drenched plantations of Georgia, a new identity was slowly being forged. Not quite British, but not yet American. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, and the labor of millions, including the first enslaved Africans brought against their will, began to build the infrastructure of a new society. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were thriving, but the relationship with the mother country, Great Britain, was fraying. The French and Indian War had removed the French threat, but left a mountain of debt. When the Crown attempted to tax the colonies without their consent, a quiet resentment turned into a loud defiance. In the candlelit taverns of Boston and the elegant halls of Philadelphia, voices like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry began to speak of natural rights. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 wasn't just a protest, it was a rejection of an old world order. Then came April 19th, 1775. In the cool morning air of Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world was fired. A ragtag group of farmers and shopkeepers stood their ground against the most powerful army on earth. The war for independence had begun. On July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian with a gifted pen, drafted the Declaration of Independence. Under the soft glow of lanterns, the Continental Congress pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the radical idea that all men are created equal. George Washington, a man of immense stoicism and quiet strength, took command of the Continental Army. His soldiers were often barefoot, starving, and outmatched, yet they endured. They survived the brutal, soul-crushing winter of Valley Forge, where the fire of revolution was kept alive not by heat, but by sheer willpower. With the help of the French and the strategic brilliance of the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, the impossible became reality. General Cornwallis surrendered, and the British bands played. The world turned upside down. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the United States as a free and independent nation. The war was over, but the true experiment, the challenge of creating a government by the people and for the people, was only just beginning. The 13 colonies were now 13 states, held together by a fragile hope and a vast, untamed wilderness stretching toward the setting sun. The Architecture of Hope and the Great Unknown, 1784, 1810. The smoke of the Revolution had finally cleared, leaving behind silence that was both beautiful and terrifying. The 13 colonies were no longer subjects of a king, but they were not yet a unified nation. They were 13 separate hearts beating to different rhythms, held together by a weak set of rules called the Articles of Confederation. The economy was trembling, and the dream of liberty felt as fragile as a glass sculpture in a storm. In the summer of 1787, a group of 55 men gathered in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia. They closed the windows of Independence Hall to keep their conversations secret, enduring the stifling air for the sake of a higher purpose. These were the architects of democracy, men like James Madison, whose mind was a library of ancient and modern governments, and Benjamin Franklin, whose wisdom was the steadying hand of the convention. They weren't just writing laws, they were wrestling with the very nature of human power. They debated, they argued, and in the quiet moments of compromise, they birthed the United States Constitution. It was a masterpiece of balance. 3 branches of government designed to check and balance one another, ensuring that the shadow of a tyrant would never again darken American soil. When the doors finally opened and a woman asked Franklin what they had created, his reply was a quiet challenge. A republic, if you can keep it. To protect the individual from the state, they added the Bill of Rights, 10 promises of freedom that would become the bedrock of the American character. In 1789, George Washington stood on a balcony in New York City, his hand on a Bible, and became the first president. He was a man who preferred the quiet life of his Virginia farm, yet he accepted the burden of leadership because he knew the world was watching. If he failed, the idea of self-rule would die with him. As Washington stepped down after 2 terms, setting a precedent of peaceful transition, the nation turned its eyes toward the horizon. The year was 1803, and Thomas Jefferson, the third president, saw an opportunity that would change the map of the world forever. For $15 million, he purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte, doubling the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. But this vast land was a mystery, a blank space on the map filled with rumors of mountains made of salt and giants in the woods. To find the truth, Jefferson turned to his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and a rugged frontiersman named William Clark. Their mission was the core of discovery. Imagine them in 1804, pushing their submerged boats against the powerful current of the Missouri River, leaving behind the last outposts of civilization. They moved through a landscape of staggering beauty, endless prairies where the buffalo darkened the earth for miles, and sky-piercing peaks of the Rockies that seemed to touch the heavens. Guided by Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman whose courage was as steady as the North Star, they became the first Americans to reach the Pacific Ocean by land. Their journey was more than a map-making expedition. It was a testament to the restless, seeking spirit of a new people. They returned with stories of wonder and journals filled with sketches of unknown plants and animals. The American wilderness was no longer a wall, it was a doorway. As the sun set on the first decade of the 19th century, the United States was a nation in its youth, growing, breathing, and looking west with an unshakable belief that its greatest chapters were yet to be written. The silence of the frontier was calling, and thousands were preparing to answer that call, carrying their dreams in covered wagons across the heart of a continent. The Iron Pulse and the Gathering Storm, 1811, 1860. As the 1800s matured, the quiet, pastoral life of the early republic began to shift. A new sound started to echo across the valleys, the rhythmic, metallic heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution. It was a time of transformation, where the muscle of man and horse was slowly being replaced by the power of steam and iron. In the north, the landscape began to change. Small villages transformed into bustling centers of commerce. The Erie Canal, a miracle of grit and engineering, sliced through the wilderness of New York, connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. Suddenly, the vast interior of the continent was open. Goods flowed, ideas traveled, and the world grew smaller. Then came the Iron Horse. The first steam locomotives breathed fire and smoke into the crisp morning air, their tracks reaching out like silver veins across the land. For the first time in human history, man could travel faster than a galloping horse. This was the era of the pioneer, the dreamer, and the risk taker. In the 1840s, the Oregon fever took hold. Imagine thousands of covered wagons stretching in a long, dusty line toward the sunset. Families left everything they knew, the comfort of the East, the graves of their ancestors, to chase a patch of soil in the fertile valleys of the West. They crossed the Great Plains, a sea of grass that seemed to have no end, and navigated the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the Sierra Nevada. Their journey was one of silent endurance, measured in miles walked and campfires lit under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than any city dweller could imagine. But as the nation stretched its limbs toward the Pacific, a dark and heavy cloud was gathering over its heart. The United States was a house divided against itself. In the north, the air hummed with the sound of textile mills and the voices of reformers calling for the end of slavery. In the south, the economy remained tethered to the soil, anchored by the labor of millions of enslaved human beings whose cries for justice were often met with silence. This was the great contradiction of America, a land that sang of liberty while holding men in chains. The tension was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. The halls of Congress became a battlefield of words, as leaders like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun struggled to find a compromise that did not exist. Every new state added to the Union, Missouri, Texas, California, became a spark in a tinderbox. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision and the haunting, powerful words of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin pushed the nation toward a breaking point. In the 1850s, the soil of bleeding Kansas was stained with the blood of neighbors, fighting neighbors. The old political parties crumbled, and from their ashes rose a new voice, a tall, somber lawyer from the prairies of Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. His voice was not loud, but his words carried the weight of a moral compass. He spoke of a nation that could not endure permanently half slave and half free. As the decade drew to a close, the silence of the American night grew heavy with anticipation. People looked at their neighbors and wondered if they would soon be enemies. The peaceful, agrarian dream of the founding fathers was fading, replaced by the grim reality of a looming conflict. In the flickering light of a billion candles across the states, a nation waited, held its breath, and prayed for a peace that was fast slipping away. The stage was set for the greatest trial in the American story, a war that would decide if the experiment of democracy would survive or perish from the earth. The Divided Heart and the New Birth of Freedom, 1861, 1867. The Silence of April, 1861, was shattered not by a whisper, but by the thunder of cannons at Fort Sumter. The long gathering storm had finally broken, and the United States, once a single tapestry of states, began to tear apart at the seams. It was a time of profound sorrow, a period where the word brother was often followed by the word enemy. The Civil War was not just a conflict of maps and borders, it was a struggle for the very definition of humanity. Families in the border states sat at dinner tables in haunting silence, knowing that one son wore the blue of the North and another wore the gray of the South. From the sun-drenched wheat fields of Antietam to the peach orchards of Gettysburg, the American landscape became a cathedral of sacrifice. The air was thick with the scent of black powder and the heavy weight of loss. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, there stood a man whose spirit seemed carved from the very oaks of the Illinois frontier. Abraham Lincoln walked the halls of the White House with a heavy tread, his face etched with the lines of a nation's grief. In 1863, with the stroke of a pen, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a quiet act that echoed like thunder, turning the war into a crusade for human dignity. A few months later, standing on the hallowed ground of Gettysburg, he spoke for only 2 minutes. His words were not a victory cry, but a meditative prayer for a new birth of freedom. He reminded a bleeding nation that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people must not perish from the earth. The war ground on through the scorched earth of Georgia and the muddy trenches of Virginia until finally, in the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse, the swords were sheathed. General Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant met in a simple parlor, one representing a lost cause, the other a preserved union. There was no gloating, only a somber respect for the ending of a tragedy. But the peace was immediately stained by the tears of a nation when Lincoln was taken by an assassin's bullet. The great emancipator was gone, leaving behind a country that was unified on paper but shattered in spirit. The era of Reconstruction began, a slow, stumbling attempt to stitch the fabric of society back together. It was a time of immense hope for the newly freed as they sought to build schools, churches, and lives of their own. For a brief moment, the sun of equality seemed to rise as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were woven into the Constitution, abolishing slavery and promising the right to vote. But the shadows of the old world were long and cold. The path to true justice was blocked by the rise of new prejudices and the quiet withdrawal of Northern support. By 1877, the soldiers had left the South, and a complicated, uneasy peace settled over the land. The country was whole again, but it bore deep, silver scars that would never truly disappear. As the sun set on the era of the Civil War, America stood at a crossroads. The agrarian past was dead, and the smoke of 1,000 new factories began to rise on the horizon. The nation was tired of war, hungry for progress, and ready to turn its eyes toward the glittering promises of a new century, a century of steel, gold, and the unyielding ambition of a people who had survived their darkest hour. The gilded horizon and the pulse of steel, 1878, 1913, as the echoes of the Civil War faded into the red clay of the South and the quiet cemeteries of the North, a new sound began to vibrate through the American soil. It was the sound of a hammer striking steel, a relentless, rhythmic beat that signaled the birth of a modern titan. The late 19th century, often called the Gilded Age, was a time when the United States transformed from a collection of quiet farming communities into a roaring engine of industry. Imagine the skylines of New York and Chicago as they were then, not yet the concrete canyons we know today, but forests of scaffolding and brick. This was the era of the great city. People were drawn to the glow of the new electric streetlights, like moths to a flame. In the quiet, dark tenements of the Lower East Side, millions of immigrants arrived from across the sea, bringing with them the languages of Europe, the recipes of their ancestors, and a desperate, burning hunger for the American dream. They walked through the gates of Ellis Island, eyes wide with wonder and fear, staring up at the Statue of Liberty, a gift of friendship that became a beacon of hope. For these new Americans, the streets weren't paved with gold, but with the grit of hard work and the shared silence of survival. While the cities climbed toward the clouds, the American West was undergoing its final, most dramatic transformation. The frontier was disappearing. The once endless prairies were being divided by the sharp silver bite of barbed wire. The great buffalo herds, which had once moved like a dark sea across the plains, were gone, replaced by the lowing of cattle and the whistles of the transcontinental railroad. This was the time of the legendary cowboy, a figure of solitude and stoicism, who rode through the vast, empty landscapes of Montana and Texas. But beneath the romantic legends of outlaws and lawmen lay a deeper, more somber truth. The expansion of the railroad meant the final displacement of the Native American tribes. The quiet dignity of leaders like Sitting Bull and Chief Joseph met the cold reality of a nation that would not stop moving. The Battle of Wounded Knee marked the somber end of an era, a moment where the old ways of the plains were buried under the winter snow. The wilderness was being tamed, carved into states, and connected by the copper wires of the telegraph. Information now traveled with the speed of lightning, turning a sprawling continent into a single, connected conversation. In the high offices of the East, a new class of men emerged, the captains of industry or the robber barons, depending on who you asked. Men like Andrew Carnegie, who turned iron into the steel skeletons of our cities, and John D. Rockefeller, who fueled the lamps and engines of a nation with oil. They built empires of wealth that the world had never seen, turning the United States into the wealthiest nation on earth. But this gold was only a thin gilding over a deeper struggle. Beneath the glittering surface, the workers, the men, women, and even children who labored in the coal mines and the garment factories began to find their voices. They stood in the quiet of the early morning, holding picket signs and dreaming of an 8-hour workday and a fair wage. The rise of labor unions was the next great struggle for American dignity, a reminder that the machine of progress must not crush the spirit of the human being. As the 1800s turned into the 1900s, a sense of progressivism took hold. Theodore Roosevelt, a man of boundless energy and a deep love for the American wilderness, entered the White House. He was a hunter who became a conservationist, a leader who believed that the government should act as a square deal for every citizen. He looked at the vast beauty of the West, the canyons of Arizona and the giant sequoias of California, and decided they belonged to the people forever. He created the national parks, ensuring that even in an age of steel and smoke, there would always be a place for silence and the song of the wild. The year 1903 brought another miracle, this time from the dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Two brothers, bicycle mechanics from Ohio, did what humans had dreamed of for centuries. They flew. The Wright brothers' first flight lasted only 12 seconds. But in those 12 seconds, the world changed forever. Distance was no longer an obstacle. The sky was no longer a limit. By the time 1913 arrived, the United States was a nation brimming with a dangerous, exciting confidence. The first Ford Model T cars were rattling down dusty roads, changing the way people lived and moved. Henry Ford's assembly line was a marvel of efficiency, turning the automobile from a luxury for the rich into a tool for the common man. America was now a world power, its navy sailing across the oceans, its culture beginning to influence the globe. But across the Atlantic, the old empires of Europe were beginning to tremble. A great darkness was approaching, a war like no other, and the quiet, isolationist peace of the American shores was about to be tested once again. The nation stood at the threshold of a new century, unaware that it would soon be called upon to lead the world through its most terrifying trials. The echoes of the Great War and the Long Shadow, 1914, 1939. As the year 1914 dawned, America was a nation that preferred its own company. It was a land of front porches, quiet Sundays, and a deep-seated belief that the troubles of the old world in Europe were oceans away, but history has a way of finding those who try to hide from it. Across the Atlantic, the great empires of Europe had stumbled into a nightmare of trenches, mustard gas, and a level of destruction the human mind could barely comprehend. For 3 years, President Woodrow Wilson tried to hold the line of neutrality, clinging to a fragile peace. But the silence of the Atlantic was broken by the shadows of submarines and the whispers of secret telegrams. In 1917, the American doughboys began to cross the sea. They arrived not as conquerors, but as a fresh heartbeat for a dying continent. The Great War was a brutal awakening. Young men from the wheat fields of Kansas and the streets of Brooklyn found themselves in the mud of the Argonne Forest, fighting for a world they had never seen. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, a generation was changed. They returned home to an America that was no longer a child. The nation had tasted the bitter fruit of global power, and the world would never look the same again. What followed was a decade that seemed like a fever dream, the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of frantic joy, as if the nation was trying to dance away the ghosts of the war. In the hidden speakeasies of the great cities, the forbidden clink of ice in glasses mixed with the revolutionary, syncopated rhythms of jazz. This was the music of a new era. Born in the black communities of New Orleans and Harlem, it became the heartbeat of a generation. The flapper emerged, a symbol of a new, independent womanhood, as the 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. It was a time of glittering excess, of Art Deco skyscrapers reaching for the moon, and the first talking motion pictures that brought a new kind of magic to the silver screen. Charles Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the lonely, dark expanse of the Atlantic, becoming a hero of the air and a symbol of human possibility. To the casual observer, it seemed the party would never end. The stock market climbed like a vine toward the sun, and the American dream felt as easy as buying a radio on credit. But the gilding was thin, and beneath the celebration, the foundations were cracking. On a Tuesday in October 1929, the music stopped. The stock market crashed with a sound that was felt in every home in America. In an instant, fortunes vanished like smoke in the wind. The Great Depression had arrived, and it was a quiet, heavy blanket of despair that settled over the land. The roar of the 20s was replaced by the silence of the breadline. Imagine the faces of men in fedoras, standing in the cold morning light, waiting for a bowl of soup. This wasn't a war of bullets. It was a war of hunger and dignity. Farmers in the Great Plains watched as their soil, exhausted and dry, rose up in massive, terrifying clouds of black dust. The Dust Bowl turned the heart of the country into a desert, forcing thousands to pile their lives into rusted cars and head west toward California, chasing the ghost of a job. In this hour of darkness, a voice emerged from the radio, warm, steady, and filled with a strange, calm confidence. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, paralyzed in his legs, but iron-willed in his spirit, sat in the White House and spoke directly into the living rooms of the American people. His fireside chats were a masterclass in calm. The only thing we have to fear, he told a trembling nation, is fear itself. He launched the New Deal, a massive, unprecedented effort to put the country back to work. From the bridges of the WPA to the forests of the CCC, the government became the employer of last resort. It was a time of quiet labor, of men planting millions of trees and building dams that would bring light to the dark corners of Appalachia. Slowly, the heartbeat of the nation began to steady. But as America struggled to find its footing, the shadows across the ocean were growing long once again. In the halls of Berlin and the streets of Tokyo, the drums of a second, even more terrible, war were beginning to beat. The long, somber decade of the 30s was coming to a close, and the American people, tired and tested by poverty, were about to face a challenge that would demand everything they had to give. The Giant Awakens and the Neon Dream, 1940 1959. The 1940s did not begin with a celebration, but with a heavy, watchful silence. The Great Depression had left the American spirit weary, and as the winds of war swept across Europe and Asia, most Americans simply wanted to keep their porch lights on and their sons at home. But on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, the peace of a tropical paradise called Pearl Harbor was shattered. In a matter of hours, the United States was no longer a spectator of history. It was the lead protagonist. The transition was breathtaking. Almost overnight, the idle factories of the Depression transformed into the arsenal of democracy. The silence of empty workshops was replaced by the clanging of shipyards and the hum of assembly lines. Millions of women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, stepped out of the kitchen and into the factory, their quiet strength proving that the home front was just as vital as the battlefront. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, a generation of young men, the greatest generation, carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. Imagine the haunting, gray dawn of June 6th, 1944. The English Channel was choppy, the air cold. Thousands of Americans stood in Higgins boats, staring at the cliffs of Normandy. D-Day was not just a military operation, it was a moral crusade. From the hedgerows of France to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the American soldier fought with a quiet, dogged persistence. Back home, families gathered around wooden radios, listening to the news with bated breath, their windows decorated with blue stars for sons at war and far too many gold stars for those who would never return. The war ended not with a whimper, but with the terrifying, blinding light of the atomic bomb. In August 1945, the world entered the nuclear age. The relief of victory was tempered by a new kind of shadow, one that could not be fought with tanks or planes alone. As the soldiers returned home, they didn't find the broken America they had left behind. They found a nation that was now the most powerful on earth. They found the GI Bill, which allowed them to trade their uniforms for college textbooks and their foxholes for the quiet safety of a suburban home. The 1950s emerged as a decade of glossy surfaces and deep, underlying tensions. It was the era of the American dream made manifest. Imagine the sprawling rows of Levittown, identical houses with white picket fences and green lawns, where the smell of charcoal grills filled the evening air. This was the age of the automobile and the interstate highway, a time when a family could pack their bags and drive across the vast heart of the country on a ribbon of smooth asphalt. The television set became the new fireplace, a glowing box in the corner of the living room that brought the same shows, the same news, and the same commercials into every home from Maine to California. But this era of conformity had its cracks. Beneath the calm, the Cold War was freezing the global atmosphere. The silence of the 50s was often interrupted by the wail of air raid sirens as school children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under wooden desks in preparation for a nuclear winter. The struggle against communism led to a climate of suspicion where a quiet word or a wrong book could end a career. Yet, in the midst of this rigidity, a new sound was beginning to stir, a sound that would eventually tear down the walls of the old world. In the South, a quiet, dignified woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, igniting a movement for civil rights that would demand the nation finally live up to its promise of equality. And in the recording studios of Memphis, a young man named Elvis Presley merged the blues, country, and gospel into a wild electric sound called rock and roll. The youth of America were beginning to wake up, their restless energy clashing with the quiet, orderly world of their parents. As the 50s drew to a close, the nation was wealthier and more comfortable than ever before. But a sense of change was in the air, a feeling that the calm of the suburbs was merely the prelude to a decade that would shake the foundations of the American soul, the fractured reflection, and the reach for the stars. 1960, 1979. The 1960s began with a sense of youthful elegance. When John F. Kennedy took the oath of office on a cold, bright January morning in 1961, he spoke of a new frontier. His voice, carried across the airwaves, was a call to a generation to ask not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. It was an era of high ideals and dangerous stakes. The world held its breath during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a quiet, terrifying standoff where the silence of the Oval Office was the only thing standing between humanity and nuclear annihilation. But just as the nation began to find its stride, that light was extinguished in a sunny plaza in Dallas. The assassination of JFK left a void that would be filled by the loud, chaotic, and transformative events of the mid 60s. This was the decade where the quiet American life was fundamentally challenged. In the South, the civil rights movement reached a crescendo. Imagine the heat of a Washington summer in 1963, where 250,000 people gathered at the feet of the Lincoln Memorial. There, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech that was more of a symphony than a sermon. His I Have a Dream speech wasn't just a demand for laws, it was a plea for the soul of the nation to finally align with its founding documents. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act followed, quiet signatures on paper that represented centuries of loud struggle. But as the nation moved toward justice at home, it waded deeper into the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War became a long, agonizing heartbeat in the background of American life. It was the first televised war, bringing the smoke and the sorrow of the front lines directly into the quiet living rooms of suburbia, the country began to fracture. On college campuses, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of protest songs. The counterculture emerged, a generation of young people who grew their hair long, questioned every authority, and looked for meaning in music, art, and a rejection of the material world. The Woodstock Festival of 1969 became a 3-day sanctuary of peace and music, a brief, muddy utopia that stood in stark contrast to the violence of the era. Yet, in the midst of this social earthquake, humanity achieved something that had been the stuff of myth for thousands of years. In July 1969, the world went silent as 3 men rode a pillar of fire into the blackness of space. When Neil Armstrong's boot touched the ancient dust of the moon, he spoke for all of us. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For a few fleeting moments, the divisions on earth seemed small, and the potential of the human spirit seemed infinite. The 1970s arrived with a collective sigh of exhaustion. The high-flying idealism of the 60s gave way to a somber reality. The Watergate scandal shook the nation's trust in the highest office of the land, leading to the first resignation of a president. The economy, once an unstoppable engine, began to sputter under the weight of oil crises and inflation. It was the era of me and the disco lights, a time when many Americans turned inward, seeking personal fulfillment in a world that felt increasingly out of control. The end of the Vietnam War left the country in a state of quiet reflection, mourning its losses and questioning its role in the world. As the 70s drew to a close, with the Iran hostage crisis dominating the news, the nation felt as though it was drifting. The lights of the great American cities were flickering, and the confidence of the post-war years had been replaced by a quiet, persistent malaise. But history, like the tides, always turns. A new decade was waiting, promising a return to strength and a digital revolution that would redefine the very meaning of the word modern.
The Eternal Journey, 2001, present. Our final chapter begins on a clear, blue September morning in 2001, a day that remains frozen in the collective memory of the world. In the span of a few hours, the world changed. The vulnerability we felt in that silence was profound, but so was the unity that followed. The War on Terror defined the first decade of the new century, taking American soldiers back to the ancient landscapes of the Middle East. At home, the nation wrestled with the balance between security and liberty, a debate as old as the Constitution itself. The 2000s also brought the Great Recession of 2008, a somber reminder of the fragility of the modern world. But even in the depths of economic struggle, the American story continued to evolve. The election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, was a moment that many thought they would never see, a quiet, powerful fulfillment of a journey that began on the slave ships of the 1600s. It was a sign that the arc of the moral universe, as Dr. King once said, does indeed bend toward justice. In the years that followed, the pace of life accelerated. The smartphone became an extension of the human hand, and social media became the new town square. We faced global pandemics that forced us back into our homes, rediscovering the quiet of our own four walls. We saw social movements that demanded the nation look even more deeply into its own reflection, striving to ensure that the promise of liberty and justice for all truly meant all. As we look at America today, the story is still being written. It is a story of contradictions, of great noise and deep silences, of immense wealth and persistent struggle. But when you look past the headlines and the static of the digital age, the calm history of this nation is still there. It is in the quiet dedication of a teacher in a rural school. It is in the steady hands of a scientist looking for a cure. It is in the soft murmur of a family at dinner, discussing their own American dream. The 2-hour journey we have taken is just a glimpse of a much larger Mahakabo epic. From the first wooden ships at Jamestown to the silver rockets of SpaceX, the American story is a testament to the fact that a nation is not just a piece of land, it is an idea. And as long as there are people who believe in that idea, the journey will continue. The horizon is still there, waiting for the next generation of dreamers to step forward into the quiet, unknown light of tomorrow. The forgotten whispers of the colonial wild, expanded detail. To understand the full measure of the American soul, we must linger longer in those first silent decades, where the line between survival and disappearance was as thin as a winter coat. In the deep, humid woods of the South and the rocky, salt-sprayed coasts of the North, the first settlers lived in a state of constant, quiet observation. Imagine the nights in a small wooden cabin in the 1650s. There were no lights except the flickering orange glow of a hearth fire. Outside, the forest was an impenetrable wall of mystery. The settlers didn't just build houses, they built a new way of thinking. They had to learn the language of the land, which berries were sweet and which were poison, how to read the clouds to predict a coming storm, and how to listen to the silence of the woods for the movement of animals or the soft footfalls of the people who were there before them. The relationship with the Native American tribes was not a single story of conflict, but a complex tapestry of trade, curiosity, and fragile peace. In the early years, there were moments of profound cultural exchange. Imagine a fur trader sitting by a fire with a member of the Iroquois Confederacy, exchanging a steel knife for a beaver pelt, two worlds meeting in a quiet clearing. These interactions shaped the American character, a blend of European tradition and frontier pragmatism. The settlers began to adopt the clothing, the crops like corn and squash, and the survival techniques of the indigenous people. This was the melted pot before the phrase was even invented. As the colonies grew, so did the diversity of the people. It wasn't just the English. In the streets of New Amsterdam, which would later become New York, you could hear 18 different languages being spoken by the mid-1600s. There were Dutch merchants, French Huguenots fleeing persecution, Swedish farmers, and Jewish refugees seeking a place to call home. This diversity brought a quiet tension, but also a vibrant energy. Each group brought a brick for the foundation of what would become the United States. We must also pause to remember the quiet suffering that built the early economy. In the tobacco fields of Virginia and the rice swamps of South Carolina, the air was heavy not just with heat, but with the sighs of the enslaved. Their history is not a footnote, it is a central pillar of the American story. Even in their bondage, they created a culture of resilience, songs that echoed through the fields, stories that kept hope alive in the dark, and a spiritual strength that would eventually change the moral compass of the nation. To hear the history of America, one must listen to the clinking of chains as well as the ringing of Liberty bells. By the early 1700s, a sense of Americanness began to bloom. It was found in the town squares of New England, where neighbors gathered to discuss local laws. It was found in the bustling markets of Philadelphia, the largest and most enlightened city in the colonies. Men like Benjamin Franklin weren't just scientists or politicians, they were the embodiment of a new kind of human, the self-made man. Franklin's printing press was the heartbeat of the colonies, spreading ideas of science, virtue, and common sense. The silence of the wilderness was now being filled with the rustle of newspapers and the scratching of quills. The colonists were no longer just subjects of a distant king. They were becoming a people of the word, a people of the law, and a people with a growing, quiet hunger for a destiny they could call their own. The long horizon and the echo of the frontier, 1815 to 1850 expanded. After the War of 1812, a strange and beautiful stillness settled over the American spirit. It was the era of good feelings, but beneath that calm was a restless energy, a collective urge to move toward the setting sun. This wasn't just a migration, it was a psychological shift. Imagine the silence of an Ohio morning in 1820. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. A family packs a single wagon with everything they own, a cast-iron stove, a bag of seed corn, a family Bible, and a hope that is as vast as the territory ahead of them. The journey west was measured not in miles, but in heartbeats and hardships. To truly understand this era, we must listen to the quiet creak of the wagon wheels, a sound that continued for months on end. There were no roads, only trails worn into the earth by those who went before. We often think of the Wild West as a place of gunfire and outlaws, but for most, it was a place of immense, heavy solitude. Imagine standing in the middle of the Great Plains, where the grass grows as high as a man's waist. There are no trees for miles, no landmarks, only the blue dome of the sky and the constant, whispering wind. This landscape forced a new kind of character upon the American people, a quiet self-reliance and a deep, spiritual connection to the land. During this time, the Canal era transformed the interior. The digging of the Erie Canal was a monumental task of human will. Imagine thousands of men, many of them Irish immigrants, standing waist-deep in mud, moving the earth one shovel at a time. When the canal finally opened, it was as if a vein had been opened to the heart of the continent. The silence of the upstate New York wilderness was replaced by the low lowing of mules pulling barges and the splashing of water in the locks. This was the first great triumph of American engineering, a quiet victory of mind over nature. But as the canal boats moved west, a different kind of power was rising in the South. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney was a small, mechanical event that had a devastatingly loud impact on history. It made cotton king, but it also anchored the institution of slavery deeper into the American soil. To tell this history calmly is to acknowledge the profound silence of the slave quarters at night, a silence filled with the longing for a freedom that felt a world away. We must pause here to consider the Trail of Tears. The forced removal of the Cherokee and other nations was a march of shadows. Imagine thousands of people walking through the snow, leaving behind the graves of their ancestors, their footsteps falling silently on a path of sorrow. This, too, is the fabric of the American story, the light of expansion always shadowed by the darkness of displacement. By the late 1840s, the discovery of gold in California sent a shockwave through the world. The 49ers weren't just looking for wealth, they were chasing a myth. Men left their families in New England and sailed around the treacherous tip of South America or trekked across the fever-ridden Isthmus of Panama. The California gold camps were places of desperate noise, but the journey there was one of long, meditative months at sea or on the trail. The Pacific coast, once a distant dream, was suddenly the new frontier. The United States now stretched from sea to shining sea, but the question remained, what kind of nation would it be? The atmosphere of the 1850s was like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy, electric, and still. In the North, the first great American writers were finding their voices. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were preaching a philosophy of transcendentalism, encouraging people to find God in the quiet of the woods rather than the noise of the city. Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond became a symbol of the American desire to live deliberately. While the politicians in Washington argued and shouted, a quiet intellectual revolution was taking place, suggesting that the true American frontier was not a piece of land, but the human soul. We must sit with this thought for a moment, that even as the nation prepared for its most violent conflict, its thinkers were calling for a return to nature and the quiet voice of conscience. The echo of the cannon and the steam revolution, 1861 to 1890 expanded. As the year 1861 bled into 1862, the American landscape changed. It was no longer a land of quiet harvests, but a map of encampments. To understand the Civil War, one must look past the grand battles and into the quiet moments of the common soldier. Imagine a young man from a farm in Maine, sitting by a low campfire in the woods of Virginia. The night is silent, save for the crackle of dry twigs and the distant, haunting call of a whippoorwill. He is writing a letter by the flickering light of a tallow candle, his hands stained with the soot of the march. These letters were the connective tissue of a broken nation, millions of messages carrying the scent of dried wildflowers and the weight of unspoken goodbyes. The war was a tragedy of intimacy, where the silence between battles was often more terrifying than the noise of the conflict itself. We must linger on the year 1863, the pivotal hinge of the century. At Gettysburg, after 3 days of unimaginable noise, a profound silence fell over the Pennsylvania hills. It was a silence that spoke of a generation lost. When Abraham Lincoln arrived months later to dedicate the cemetery, his voice was thin and high, carried by the autumn wind. He didn't speak of vengeance, he spoke of the brave men, living and dead, who struggled here. The Gettysburg Address was a meditation on the cost of freedom. It lasted only 2 minutes, but in that brief span of time, Lincoln redefined the American purpose. He moved the nation from a collection of states to a single, unified idea. As the war ended and the morning began, the nation did not sit still. A different kind of transformation was waiting in the wings. The Transcontinental Railroad was being stitched across the belly of the continent. Imagine the scene in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah. 2 steam engines, the Union Pacific's No. 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, stood nose to nose. A golden spike was driven into a tie of polished laurel wood. In that moment, the Wild West was fundamentally changed. The journey that once took 6 months by wagon now took 6 days by rail. The silence of the desert was now punctuated by the lonesome, beautiful wail of a train whistle, a sound that would become the new anthem of American progress. But this progress had a cold, metallic edge. We move now into the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe a society that was glittering on the surface but corrupt underneath. The air of America began to change. In places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, the sky was no longer blue, it was a bruised purple and gray, filled with the thick, sulfurous smoke of the steel mills. Imagine the life of a steelworker in the 1880s. He leaves his home in the dark, the cobblestones slick with soot. He spends 12 hours in a cathedral of fire and iron, where the heat is so intense it feels like a physical weight. This was the new America, a place of immense power and immense struggle. The wealth generated in this era was staggering. In New York City, the 400, the elite of society, threw parties where dogs wore diamond collars and guests dug for rubies in silver bowls of sand. But just a few blocks away, in the tenements of Mulberry Street, families of 10 lived in single, windowless rooms. The silence of the poor was a heavy contrast to the clinking of champagne glasses in the mansions of Fifth Avenue. This was the era of the Great Divide, and it gave birth to a new American spirit of reform. We must also look to the South during this time, where Reconstruction had failed to bring true equality. The Jim Crow era began, a long, quiet winter for civil rights. The dreams of the 1860s were deferred, replaced by a system of segregation that would take another century to dismantle. Yet, even in this darkness, the culture of the South gave the world a gift of immense beauty. In the Mississippi Delta, the blues were born, a music that turned sorrow into art, a quiet, rhythmic moaning of the soul that would eventually become the foundation of all modern American music. As the 1880s drew to a close, the frontier was officially declared closed. The vast, open spaces had been mapped, fenced, and tamed. The American people began to look inward, to their cities, and upward, to the new inventions of Thomas Edison. The light bulb was perhaps the greatest, quiet revolution of all. Suddenly, the night was no longer a time of forced rest. The American day was extended, the darkness was pushed back, and a nation of dreamers began to work and play long after the sun had set. The Great Migration and the glow of the new century, 1890 to 1914, expanded. As the 19th century exhaled its final breaths, a new kind of silence descended upon the American landscape, the silence of the machine age. The year 1893 saw the White City of the Chicago World's Fair. Imagine walking through those gates at twilight. Thousands of incandescent bulbs, a miracle of Tesla and Westinghouse, flickered to life simultaneously, reflecting off the man-made lagoons. For the first time, the night did not belong to the moon, it belonged to man. This was the promise of the coming 20th century, a world of light, speed, and infinite possibility. But away from the glittering fairs, the true heartbeat of America was being felt in the hulls of giant steamships crossing the Atlantic. The story of the American immigrant in the 1890s is a story of profound, quiet courage. Imagine the air inside a crowded steerage compartment, thick with the smell of salt, unwashed wool, and the nervous breath of 1,000 different dreams. These families weren't just moving to a new country, they were shedding their past lives like old skin. When they reached Ellis Island, the silence of the ocean was replaced by a cacophony of languages: Italian, Yiddish, Polish, Greek. Yet, in the eyes of the inspectors and the physicians, there was a shared, silent question: are you strong enough to build this nation? They moved into the tenements of the North and the coal patches of Pennsylvania, their quiet labor providing the fuel for the American engine. We must sit with the image of a mother in a crowded New York apartment, sewing by the light of a single window, her mind wandering back to a village in Sicily, while her children learn the English words that will distance them from her forever. In the South and the West, another great movement was beginning, the Great Migration. This was a quiet, steady exodus of African Americans leaving the oppressive shadows of the Jim Crow South for the promised land of the northern cities. It wasn't a single event, but a million individual decisions. Imagine a family packing their bags in the middle of the night in a small Georgia town, catching the midnight special train toward Chicago or Detroit. They carried with them only what they could fit in a trunk, but they also brought the blues, the gospel, and a hunger for a dignity that had been denied to them for centuries. This movement would eventually redefine the American city, creating the cultural vibrance of the Harlem Renaissance and the rhythmic foundations of modern music. As we move into the early 1900s, the progressive era brought a new kind of quiet reflection to the government. This was the time of the muckrakers, journalists who used the power of the printed word to expose the dark corners of the factories and the slums. Imagine the impact of a photograph by Jacob Riis, showing the other half in their windowless rooms. These images didn't need words, their silence was a scream for justice. Under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt, the nation began to realize that its natural beauty was not an endless resource to be looted, but a sacred trust to be protected. We must pause to appreciate the quiet of the American wilderness in 1905. Imagine Roosevelt sitting by a campfire with John Muir in the Yosemite Valley. The giant sequoias stood like ancient sentinels above them. In the stillness of that night, the idea of the national parks was solidified. It was a realization that as the cities grew louder, the human soul would need the silence of the forest to remain whole. This was the era where America decided to save its own heart. Then, the world began to move faster. The year 1908 brought the Model T. Henry Ford didn't just invent a car, he invented a new way of existing. The assembly line was a rhythmic, repetitive dance of man and metal. Imagine the factory floor, the hiss of steam, the clanging of hammers, the quiet focus of thousands of men performing the same motion over and over. The horse-drawn world was fading. The quiet dusty roads of the countryside were being paved over with concrete. The isolation of the American farmer was ending, as the car and the telephone began to weave the nation into a single, connected web. But as the lights of the cities grew brighter and the cars rattled louder, a shadow was growing across the sea. The old empires of Europe were caught in a tangled web of secret treaties and ancient grudges. In America, people read about the tensions in the newspapers, but it felt as distant as a dream. They were too busy building skyscrapers, watching the first silent films, and listening to the new ragtime music. They didn't know that the peace of their long, sun-drenched afternoons was about to be shattered. They didn't know that the 20th century was about to demand a sacrifice unlike anything they had ever imagined. The shattered silence and the fever of the new, 1914 to 1929 expanded. As the summer of 1914 arrived, the American heart was focused inward. The nation was enjoying a long, golden afternoon of peace. Imagine a Sunday in a small Midwestern town. The air is still, the only sound is the rhythmic creak of a porch swing and the distant tolling of a church bell. But across the Atlantic, the world was beginning to burn. When the news of the Great War reached American shores, it was met with a quiet, collective desire to look away. Neutrality was not just a political stance, it was a prayer. But as the months turned into years, the silence of the ocean was violated by the cold, metallic shadows of U-boats. The sinking of the Lusitania wasn't just a tragedy of the sea, it was the moment the American dream realized it could no longer be an island. In 1917, the quiet of the training camps began. Millions of young men, many of whom had never traveled more than 20 miles from the farms where they were born, found themselves draped in olive drab wool, boarding giant ships in New York Harbor. The journey across the Atlantic was a time of profound, internal silence. Imagine the deck of a troopship at night, the black waves churning below, and the realization that the world they were heading toward was one of fire and steel. When they reached the Western Front, they encountered a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The Great War was a war of mud and waiting. We must pause to consider the silence of the trenches. It was a heavy, terrifying silence, punctuated only by the distant thud of artillery and the scurrying of rats. In those moments of quiet, the American doughboy realized that the old romantic notions of glory were dead. This was an industrial war, where man was small and the machine was God. When the armistice finally arrived in November 1918, the world didn't cheer immediately, it took a long, deep breath. The silence that followed the final gunfire was the loudest sound in history. But the soldiers returned to an America that was no longer sure of itself. The lost generation was born, a group of writers and thinkers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald who found the old values of their parents hollow. As they grappled with their ghosts, the nation plunged into a decade of frantic, beautiful noise, the Roaring Twenties. But to understand the 20s, we must look past the glitter. Behind the neon lights of the Jazz Age was a quiet, revolutionary shift in the American home. The 1920s saw the birth of the modern consumer. Imagine the soft, blue glow of a vacuum tube in a new radio set. For the first time, millions of people across the continent were hearing the same voice, the same music, at the very same moment. This was the true American unification. The silence of the rural night was now filled with the crackling sounds of jazz from New Orleans and news from New York. In the kitchens of the new suburban homes, the hum of the refrigerator and the whir of the washing machine were the sounds of a new freedom for women, whose lives had been tethered to the manual labor of the hearth for centuries. But there was a darker, quieter side to this decade: prohibition. The noble experiment turned the nation's taverns into speakeasies, hidden behind unmarked doors in dark alleys. To enter, you had to speak a password in a whisper. This era of secret drinking created a new kind of American mythology: the gangster, the bootlegger, and the high-speed car chase on dark country roads. The law was being broken in silence, and a new kind of cynicism was beginning to take root in the American character. While the cities roared, the heartland began to suffer in a way that was quiet and overlooked. The farmers, who had produced so much during the war, now found themselves with too much food and too little money. The Great Depression, for the American farmer, didn't start in 1929, it started years earlier, as the prices of wheat and corn fell like stones. In the small towns of the South and the plains, the silence of the bank closure and the empty general store became a common reality. As we reached the year 1929, the atmosphere was one of extreme, fragile tension. The stock market had become a national obsession, a get-rich-quick fever that infected everyone from the shoeshine boy to the corporate tycoon. People were buying pieces of companies with money they didn't have, fueled by a quiet, dangerous confidence that the party would never end. The skyline of New York was climbing higher and higher, with the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building reaching for the stars like monuments to human ego. Then came October 29th, Black Tuesday. The crash wasn't a loud explosion, it was the quiet, frantic rustling of paper as millions of shares were sold for nothing. It was the sound of tickers running hours late, and the stunned silence of men standing on Wall Street, staring at the numbers as their lives vanished. The Roaring Twenties ended not with a bang, but with a cold, gray morning. The music stopped, the lights dimmed, and the nation began a long, slow walk into a decade of darkness that would test every fiber of the American soul. The Arsenal of Democracy and the Crimson Tide, 1939 to 1945, expanded. As the 1930s drew to a close, the American spirit was still healing from the wounds of the Great Depression. The country was like a convalescent, enjoying the quiet sun on a front porch, watching the world from a distance. But across the oceans, the silence of the old world was being torn apart by the scream of Stuka dive bombers and the rhythmic, terrifying clank of panzer treads. For 2 years, America watched in a state of armed neutrality. Imagine the atmosphere of 1940, the hushed conversations in general stores, the focused gaze of men reading newspapers on the subway. President Roosevelt, in his quiet, resolute way, began to prepare the great giant for a trial he knew was coming. Then came December 7, 1941. The day did not begin with a roar, but with the peaceful, tropical calm of a Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sound of waves against the hulls of the Pacific Fleet was suddenly replaced by the drone of planes that shouldn't have been there. In a single hour, the isolation of America was buried forever. The news reached the mainland in the afternoon, a quiet, shocking interruption to radio programs and family dinners. The silence that followed was not one of fear, but of a cold, hard resolve. The sleeping giant had not just been awakened, it had been reborn. What followed was a miracle of human industry. To reach our 2-hour goal, we must pause to appreciate the sheer scale of the transformation. Imagine the silence of an idle factory in Detroit or Pittsburgh. Suddenly, that silence is shattered by the sound of thousands of workers, men and women, streaming through the gates. The home front was a landscape of relentless motion. Women like Rosie the Riveter stepped into the heat of the welding arc, their quiet precision building the planes and ships that would liberate a continent. By 1943, the United States was producing a ship every few days and a plane every few minutes. This was the arsenal of democracy, a quiet, industrial symphony that proved that the power of a free people was greater than any machine of war. But the heart of the story lies in the individual experience of the GI. Imagine a 20-year-old from the mountains of Tennessee or the streets of Brooklyn. He is standing on the deck of a troopship, staring into the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic or the vast, lonely blue of the Pacific. These men carried with them the quiet values of their homes, the memory of a mother's cooking, the smell of the first spring rain on a farm, the hope of a girl waiting back home. They were not soldiers by trade, they were citizens in uniform. The war was a collection of haunting, silent moments. Imagine the pre-dawn mist on June 6, 1944. The English Channel was a graveyard of nerves as thousands of men waited in the landing craft. When the ramps dropped at Normandy, the silence was replaced by a chaos that defied description. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen, dark forests of the Ardennes, the American soldier moved with a dogged, quiet persistence. In the Pacific, the war was a struggle of islands, names like Iwo Jima and Okinawa that became synonymous with a level of sacrifice that the human mind could barely grasp. Imagine the silence of a jungle night, where the only sound was the drip of rain on a helmet and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a friend in the foxhole next to you. By 1945, the world was exhausted. The death of President Roosevelt in April brought a profound, national silence, a feeling that the father of the nation had guided them to the promised land but could not enter it himself. When the war finally ended in August, it wasn't just with a celebration, but with a terrifying, blinding light over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic age had arrived in a flash of heat, ending the most destructive war in history and leaving the world in a state of stunned, quiet reflection. The American soldiers returned to a country that was no longer just a nation among nations, but the leader of the free world. They brought with them the thousand-yard stare of those who had seen too much, but they also brought a quiet, burning desire to build a life of peace. They traded their rifles for hammers and their uniforms for suits. The greatest generation had saved the world, and now, in the quiet suburbs and the growing cities, they were ready to build the modern American dream. But as the sun set on 1945, a new kind of shadow was already stretching across the globe, a cold, silent war that would last for the next 40 years. To continue reaching your 2-hour total, we must now slow down and savor the transformation of the mid-20th century. This was an era of glossy surfaces but deep, quiet anxieties. For the meditative male voice, speak with a sense of suburban calm, smooth, steady, and slightly nostalgic, but with a low, serious vibration when discussing the Cold War. Part 18, The Neon Peace and the Frozen Horizon, 1946 to 1960 expanded. As the year 1946 dawned, the world felt as though it was waking up from a long, feverish nightmare. The soldiers who had lived in the mud and the fire for years were now coming home. Imagine the quiet of a train station in a small town in Iowa or a bustling pier in San Francisco. Thousands of men in rumpled uniforms, carrying duffel bags filled with souvenirs and memories they would never speak of, stepped onto the soil they had fought to protect. They were looking for a life that was quiet, predictable, and safe. This collective longing for stability gave birth to the suburban dream. The late 1940s and early 50s saw the rise of Levittown and the cookie-cutter houses. Imagine the sound of 1,000 hammers echoing across a former potato field on Long Island. This was the new American frontier, not a wilderness to be conquered, but a lawn to be mowed. For the first time, the middle class became a physical reality. In the quiet, sun-drenched afternoons of the 1950s, the American home became a temple of technology. The hum of the electric refrigerator, the whir of the toaster, and the rhythmic slosh of the automatic washing machine were the new background music of life. And then, there was the glow. By 1955, the television set had moved from a luxury to a necessity. Imagine a family sitting in the bluish light of a living room, watching the same images as millions of others. This mass culture created a sense of national unity that was quiet, powerful, and unprecedented. But beneath this veneer of white picket fences and family dinners, a Cold War was freezing the global atmosphere. This was a war of silences and shadows. Imagine the atmosphere of an elementary school classroom in 1953. The teacher interrupts the lesson for a duck and cover drill. In the sudden, heavy silence, children hide under their wooden desks, protecting their heads from a sun that might explode at any moment. This was the nuclear anxiety, a quiet, persistent fear that lived in the back of every mind. The sky was no longer just a place for clouds, it was a place where Sputnik, a small, beeping silver ball, signaled that the Soviet Union had reached the stars first. The silence of the night sky was now filled with the tension of the space race. The 1950s also saw the quiet, steady birth of the interstate highway system. Under President Eisenhower, the nation began to be paved in silver ribbons of concrete. Imagine the feeling of freedom, of packing a station wagon and driving for days without ever seeing a stoplight. The road trip became a new American ritual, a meditative journey through the changing landscapes of the plains, the desert, and the mountains. But as the highways bypassed the small towns, the old America began to fade into a quiet, dusty memory. We must also look at the cracks in the suburban golden age. In the South, the silence of segregation was being challenged by a dignity that was louder than any shout. Imagine the atmosphere in a courtroom in 1954 during the Brown versus Board of Education case. The lawyers' quiet arguments were dismantling a century of separate but equal. Imagine the stillness of a bus in Montgomery in 1955, as Rosa Parks remained seated. Her silence was a revolutionary act. The civil rights movement didn't begin with a riot, it began with the quiet, unyielding courage of individuals who decided that the time for waiting was over. As the decade drew to a close, a new sound was emerging from the garages and small studios of the nation. It was a sound that the parents of the 50s found terrifying. It was the distorted, electric growl of a guitar and the heavy, driving beat of a drum kit. Rock and roll was the voice of a new generation that had grown up in the safety of the suburbs and was now looking for something more, something loud, something real. As the 1960s approached, the neon piece was beginning to vibrate with the energy of a storm. The nation was about to step out of the quiet of the 50s and into a decade of fire, stars, and a struggle for the very heart of the American promise. The Technicolor Dream and the Lunar Silence, 1960 to 1975 expanded. The 1960s did not arrive with a whisper, they arrived with a heartbeat that felt faster than any decade before. When the young, charismatic John F. Kennedy took the stage, he spoke of a new frontier, and for a moment, the air in America felt lighter, charged with a strange, electric hope. But this was also the era of the Great Contradiction. While suburban families sat in their air-conditioned homes, the streets of the South were filled with the quiet, rhythmic footsteps of marchers. Imagine the atmosphere of the March on Washington in 1963. The heat was a physical weight, the air still. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before the Lincoln Memorial, his voice didn't just carry across the mall, it carried across time. "I have a dream," he said, and in that moment, the silence of 1,000 years of oppression was broken by a vision of a future where children would be judged by the content of their character. This was the moral peak of the American century, a quiet realization that a nation cannot truly be free until all its citizens can breathe the same air of dignity. But history is a pendulum. The hope of the early 60s was shattered by a series of cracks: the assassinations of JFK, his brother Bobby, and Dr. King himself. Each event left the nation in a state of stunned, grieving silence. And then, there was Vietnam. To understand this era, we must listen to the sounds of the living room. The evening news brought the thwack-thwack of helicopter blades into the quiet of the American dinner hour. It was a war of shadows and jungles, a conflict that tore at the fabric of the American family. The generation gap became a canyon, with parents and children staring at each other across a divide of music, hair, and beliefs. Yet, in 1969, we looked up. Imagine the silence of the moon, a silence that had lasted for 4 billion years. When the eagle landed, and the world watched that grainy, black and white feed, for a few seconds, 300 million Americans held their breath as one. In the vast, cold vacuum of space, we saw our blue marble, for the first time, a small, fragile, and incredibly beautiful home. It was a meditative moment for the entire species, a realization that our borders and our battles were small compared to the infinite dark. Part 20, The Digital Pulse and the Infinite Horizon, 1976, present. As we moved into the final quarter of the 20th century, the pace of the American story began to change again. The industrial age was quietly fading, replaced by the information age. Imagine the quiet of a garage in 1976, where a few young men were soldering wires onto a green circuit board. They weren't building a machine for a factory, they were building a window into a new world. The personal computer changed the sound of the American home, from the roar of the lawnmower to the quiet click-clack of the keyboard. The 1980s and 90s were a time of the Great Connection. We watched the Berlin Wall crumble, a moment of such profound historical silence that the world seemed to stop spinning for a day. We saw the rise of the Internet, a digital web that connected a farmer in Nebraska to a trader in Tokyo in a fraction of a second. But this connection brought a new kind of solitude. We became a nation of glowing screens, our conversations moving from the front porch to the digital ether. As we entered the 21st century, the journey became even more complex. We faced the smoke of 9/11, the uncertainty of global pandemics, and the urgent, quiet ticking of a changing climate. But through it all, the meditative history of America remains. It is found in the quiet persistence of the immigrant arriving today with the same hope as those at Ellis Island. It is found in the scientist staring into a microscope, looking for the next miracle. It is found in you, the listener, taking this 2-hour journey through time. The story of America is not a finished book, it is a living, breathing meditation. It is a long, winding road that began with a wooden ship and leads, eventually, to the stars. As we close this narrative, let the silence of the past stay with you. Remember that every great achievement began with a quiet thought, and every great movement began with a single, silent step. The horizon is still there, and the American dream, though often tested, remains a quiet, unshakable belief that tomorrow can be better than today. The architecture of the American soul, philosophy and arts. History is not merely a record of wars and legislation, it is the resonance of the human spirit in its daily struggle for meaning. To reach the full depth of our 2-hour meditation, we must pause and listen to the whispers of those whose names are not carved in marble, yet whose lives formed the bedrock of the national character. Imagine a small, lonely cabin in the Appalachian Mountains in the mid-1800s. As winter snow blankets the peaks, a family huddles near a stone hearth. The songs they sing, melodies brought over from Scotland and Ireland, mingled with the rhythms of the frontier, are the seeds of American music. This old-time music was a meditation on survival. It eventually flowed down the mountains, meeting the soulful cries of the Delta blues and the rhythmic pulse of the cities to create jazz. Jazz is perhaps the greatest American metaphor, a music that requires individual genius but thrives on collective improvisation. It taught the world that out of chaos, we can find a shared harmony. As the cities grew in the 20th century, a new kind of silence emerged, the silence of the crowd. We see it in the paintings of Edward Hopper, where a lone individual sits in a brightly lit diner late at night. This reflects a shift in the American soul. As we became more connected by roads and wires, we became more introspective. This solitude birthed a unique literary voice, writers who explored the great American novel, searching for the truth of what it means to be a human being in a land that is constantly changing. In the quiet laboratories of the 1970s and 80s, this spirit of inquiry moved from the page to the silicon chip. The pioneers of the digital age were often solitary dreamers. They weren't looking to conquer territories, they were looking to conquer the limitations of the human mind. The click of the first mouse and the glow of the first personal computer screen were quiet events, but they were the beginning of a new way of being. We transitioned from a nation of builders to a nation of thinkers, weaving a digital tapestry that now connects every heart on the planet. The infinite horizon, space, nature, and legacy. Now, we stand at the very edge of the present, looking toward a future that feels both thrilling and uncertain. But the story of America has always been about the next horizon. Our eyes have turned from the plains to the stars. In the quiet halls of NASA, when a rover descends toward the red dust of Mars, there is a period known as the 7 minutes of terror. It is a deep, agonizing silence where humanity waits to see if its ambition has once again outpaced the impossible. This silence is the modern equivalent of the pioneer staring across the Atlantic or the settler looking at the Rocky Mountains. We are still explorers, we have only changed our vessels from wood to titanium. This journey of 2 hours has shown us that the American dream is not a destination, but a process of constant renewal. It is a river that is sometimes turbulent, sometimes calm, but always moving. It is the story of a people who refuse to stay still. As we conclude this narrative, listen to the silence around you. In that stillness lies the potential for the next great chapter. Perhaps it is a student in a library discovering a new philosophy, or an inventor in a garage finding a way to heal the earth. History teaches us that darkness is always followed by dawn, and that the greatest strength of a nation lies in its ability to listen to its own quiet, inner voice. The Suburban Sunset and the Green Awakening, 1970 to 1995 expanded. As we move deeper into the final third of our journey, we must pause to consider the changing face of the American neighborhood. The mid-1970s brought a quiet shift in the rhythm of the household. The air was filled with the sounds of a nation re-evaluating its path. Imagine a summer evening in 1976, the bicentennial year. Across the country, in small towns and city blocks, people gathered not just to celebrate 200 years of history, but to find their footing after a decade of upheaval. This was the era of the environmental awakening. For the first time, the nation began to look at its blue skies and clear rivers as treasures that could be lost. The first Earth Day was not a loud protest, but a quiet, collective realization. Imagine the silence of a forest that had been protected from the axe, or the return of the bald eagle to skies where it had once vanished. This was a new kind of American pride, one based on preservation rather than just production. It was a meditative shift from conquering the wilderness to cherishing it. In the 1980s, the mall culture became the new town square. Imagine the soft hum of neon lights and the rhythmic click of heels on polished marble floors. It was a world of glossy surfaces, but in the quiet corners of these cathedrals of commerce, a new generation was finding its identity. This was the decade of the digital seed. In schools across the country, children were sitting in front of the first glowing green monitors, learning a language of code that would eventually rewrite the world. The silence of the computer lab was the sound of the future being built, one keystroke at a time. The global village and the quiet present, 1996, present expanded. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, the American home underwent its most profound transformation since the invention of electricity. The information superhighway entered the living room through the phone line. Imagine the strange, rhythmic melody of the dial-up modem, a sound that signaled the end of isolation. Suddenly, a teenager in a rural farmhouse could talk to a student in Tokyo. The world was shrinking, becoming a global village. But with this connection came a new kind of responsibility. The early 2000s forced the nation to look outward with a more serious, somber gaze. We learned that the events in a distant mountain range could affect the safety of our own streets. The silence that fell over New York City in September 2001 was a silence felt in every corner of the globe. It was a moment of profound unity, where the noise of politics was replaced by the quiet, steady beat of millions of hearts grieving as one. In the final years of our narrative, we see an America that is more diverse, more connected, and more introspective than ever before. We are a nation that is still wrestling with its oldest questions. How do we balance liberty with security? How do we ensure that the American dream is accessible to everyone, regardless of where they started? These are not questions that are answered in shouts, they are answered in the quiet, daily choices of millions of citizens. We conclude this 2-hour meditation by acknowledging that history is not just behind us, it is all around us. It is in the wind that turns the giant white turbines on the plains of Texas, it is in the quiet hum of the electric car charging in a garage in California, it is in the soft light of a smartphone screen held by a person dreaming of a better life. The story of the United States is a story of unfinished business. It is a grand, beautiful, and sometimes painful experiment in human self-rule. As the final echoes of this script fade, let the silence be a reminder that you are the architect of what comes next. The horizon is not a wall, it is a door. And that door is always open. The Digital Dawn and the Global Mirror, 1980 to 2000. As the 1980s arrived, the weary atmosphere of the previous decade began to lift, replaced by a bold, bright, and often loud sense of renewal. Ronald Reagan entered the White House with a voice that was as smooth as a velvet curtain, speaking of a morning in America. He brought a message of strength and a belief in the unyielding power of the individual. This was the decade of the Great Expansion, where the American skyline grew even taller with glass and steel. But beyond the politics, a quiet revolution was happening on the desks of ordinary citizens. In garages in California, young dreamers were tinkering with circuit boards and glowing screens. The personal computer was born, a quiet hum that would eventually change the way every human being on Earth communicated, worked, and dreamed. The 1980s were also a time of high-stakes drama on the world stage. The Cold War, which had frozen the world in a state of nuclear anxiety for 40 years, reached its final, dramatic chapter. The Iron Curtain wasn't torn down by tanks, but by the quiet, persistent hunger for freedom among the people of Eastern Europe. When the Berlin Wall finally crumbled in 1989, the world watched in a stunned, beautiful silence. The shadow of the Great War and the Cold War seemed to finally lift, leaving America as the world's lone superpower, a position of immense pride, but also immense weight. The 1990s emerged as a decade of strange, glittering peace. It was a time of the information superhighway. The World Wide Web, once a tool for scientists, became a part of the American home. The dial-up tone of a modem became the new anthem of progress. It was a decade of rapid globalization, where the boundaries of the world seemed to melt away. We watched the first 24-hour news cycles, and for the first time, we saw the world in real time. In the mid-90s, the economy soared, fueled by the dot-com boom. It felt as though the cycle of history had finally been broken, that prosperity and peace were the new permanent reality. But as the clock ticked toward the year 2000, the Y2K that many feared would crash the digital world, the nation realized that the new century would not be as simple as the last. The Y2K bug turned out to be a quiet non-event, but the dawn of the 21st century brought a different kind of awakening. The 1990s ended with a sense of immense comfort, yet there was a growing awareness of the complexities of a connected world, a world where a whisper in one corner of the globe could cause a storm in another. As we stood on the threshold of the new millennium, the American story was no longer just about frontiers of land or sea. It was about the frontiers of the mind and the digital ether. We were a nation of 300 million people, a vast tapestry of every race, religion, and dream imaginable. The silence of the 17th century forest was long gone, replaced by the digital pulse of a billion connections. But the core of the American character, that restless, seeking, and quietly resilient spirit, remained unchanged. We were ready for the future, unaware that the first decade of the 2000s would test that resilience in ways we never could have imagined.